Did you think that at this point Liberia would have started the implementation of some of the recommendations in our report? Is the U.S. government in any way disappointed that we as a nation have not been able to venture into those recommendations?
It has been more than a decade since that report was issued, and so I think one would have expected to see greater progress at this point. I was just, as I mentioned, in the Gambia. Their report was only released a couple of years ago, and they're already talking about implementation now. So it does feel like there's been a delay.
You think it's promoting impunity in your view?
It isn't promoting impunity. If you don't have some sort of a justice process for the worst crimes known to humankind, how can you expect to have justice for ordinary crimes that people are experiencing on a daily basis?
Will you meet with the president?
No, not this trip, unfortunately, but I do hope to in the future.
You're not meeting with the government at any level?
We met with the Minister of Justice yesterday, and I'll be meeting with some representatives later today.
You want to tell us what exactly did you want from him?
From the Minister of Justice? We spoke mostly at a technical level about the kinds of moves that could be made in the justice sector to create a specialized chamber of some sort to focus on war crimes and economic crimes, recognizing that those two sets of crimes are often interlinked here in Liberia and elsewhere around the world. So we spoke, I'm a lawyer myself, having worked for many years in this field. We spoke about some of the different models for justice that are available, that have been used around the world, and how they might be adapted for the Liberian context.
Now, we fought war in this country, war that lasted for several years. Estimatedly, they say more than 250,000 people died as a result of the war. They are concerned because some of the people who perpetrated heinous crimes are either in the legislature or in branches of our government. What does the end on this?
Captured the state of play perfectly. Obviously, it's difficult to address crimes of the past, particularly when those who might be deemed responsible or who were adversely mentioned in the Truth Commission report are now holding positions of power. So there's caution here, of course. It's expensive. There are many other priorities facing the Liberian state, including issues of health and education and food. And so it's always a balancing act. That said, there's and those calls are not quieting over the years. If anything, they're getting louder, because I think people recognize the link between impunity for corruption crimes and impunity for international. These are linked in people's minds, and I think they're linked in reality. And so the calls continue. Ultimately, this will be a Liberian-led process. It has to be the people and civil society working with and demanding justice from their elected representatives, and the government needs to be responsive to the people. And so if there are valid proposals being put forth, draft legislation, etc., it's for the government to work with their constituencies to determine the best path forward.
And that's the point a lot of Liberians sometimes think that America, the U.S., you are not definite about what do you think, what do you want, in the context of whether a war crimes could. And you always say, it's a Liberian issue. The Liberian people will decide, Why are you not definite?
Well, what I can say is that we generally promote justice around the world. The reason my very position in government exists is to promote justice for the commission of international crimes. So that is our basic position around the world, and we do that when it comes to the genocide against the Rohingya, genocide against Uyghur people in China, genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity anywhere where they may be committed around the world. And so that is our baseline position, but ultimately we are a partner. We're a partner with with other nations as they make the decisions themselves how to address this terrible history that they may have experienced. We say from academic research that it's not enough to simply say the past is the past, let's look to the future, because if those grievances go unaddressed, they will continue to haunt societies. People will take justice into their own hands. People will lose faith in the government, lose faith in the concept of justice altogether. And so that's why we are a strong believer in states undertaking some sort of a transitional justice process in order to address the crimes of the past, respond to the needs of the victims, and create a better and a more holistic, inclusive society going forward.
Some Liberians, Madam Ambassador, for example, are suggesting that the United States make the setting up of the code a precondition for certain cooperation with the Liberian government. What do you think?
That's not where we are at the moment. We're still in very much a learning mode, but we would encourage individuals to look at all valid proposals and to respond to the demands of individuals for some sort of a justice process. When we think about transitional justice, there's lots of components to it. One component, of course, is a criminal justice response for those most responsible. And that may be not an enormous number of people. It could be decided to focus on those who were in a leadership position or who were responsible for the most emblematic cases, like the Lutheran Church massacre, for example, where 600 souls lost their lives in a place of worship. Then you could imagine a truth-telling process where even perpetrators could come forward, acknowledge what they did, ask for forgiveness from the nation and from their victims, and provide some sort of a service back to the community to rebuild the body politic. Then you would have rehabilitation of survivors, focusing on psychosocial rehabilitation, health, education for their children, things that will help them, livelihood assistance, get back on their feet and heal from the trauma that was experienced during the, as you mentioned, 2 terrible civil wars. And then finally, the final component of transitional justice is often guarantees of non-repetition, putting in place reforms that will ensure that Liberia never again returns to those terrible periods when you were at war with each other.
How will Washington react, for example, if in the end, people who committed these atrocities in Liberia during the war were never tried?
That would be an unfortunate outcome because, as I mentioned, we have seen that societies that do not address crimes in the past are often destined to see them repeated. And so we would hope that the Liberian community, society, individuals, civil society, faith-based organizations, government representatives could work together to find a path forward. What we have seen is justice abroad, right? You have seen a number of cases in Europe and even in my own system in the United States when perpetrators have traveled. In addition, now you have a new case that was filed just this week before the ECOWAS court by the Global Justice Resource Center, a local civil society organization, basically bringing allegations against the state of Liberia, arguing that nothing has been done, and so Liberia is now in breach of its international obligations to provide access to justice and to respond to crimes of the past. These are claims that are being brought under treaties that Liberia has ratified and so has taken on those obligations. The African Charter of Human and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Treaty Against Torture, all of these obligate states to investigate and prosecute violations of international human rights and to provide a remedy for victims. And this new case that was filed by the Global Justice Resource Center argues that Liberia is in breach of those obligations.
Now, there are some Liberians who also believe that, the current position of the U.S. government it seems as though they want the War Crimes Court established, even though the government of the U.S. is not as definite as some Liberians thought it would be. Now, I don't know whether this is an impression or that's the fact that your government is interested in showing justice for Liberian war victims. You want this court established in the end. Someone is thinking, why didn't you push the way you're pushing now 12 years ago when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, one of those who history or the TRC report tells us was involved in the war? She was president here. Why didn't the U.S. push the way you push it now?
I wasn't in government at that time, so I'm not aware of what was done at the time. I'm not aware of where U.S. policy was, but what I can say is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did make a very clear recommendation, and that recommendation was one that was created by an institution that was completely Liberian-led. This was not an international Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This was a Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And those recommendations, as a result, I think are really entitled to great weight and should be taken very seriously by those in a position of power and authority within the government to implement policies that will reflect and respect those recommendations.
In the event the government of Liberia, is willing to get this thing started, is the U.S. government in any way willing to help Liberia achieve this?
100%.
You say that again?
We will absolutely be supportive if Liberia moves forward with this war crimes special chambers or a hybrid court or any sort of a justice mechanism. I would hope that everyone would consider us a very close partner in this effort. But as I mentioned, it has to be Liberian-led. It has to be created by Liberians for Liberia. And when that is the case, I know that the international community stands ready to be of assistance.
So, for example, what do you want? How do we as a nation say we are prepared? Where does it start? I mean, you're a lawyer, so that's what I'm asking. The way you see it, who's supposed to do what?
I can discuss what I've seen elsewhere. So often what you have is a piece of legislation that creates a special chamber that would potentially allow international expertise to sit side by side with their Liberian counterparts. This has a nice mix of local legitimacy. These are Liberians meting out justice for Liberians, but then bringing in international assistance expertise who have worked on these cases in other systems. That probably requires some legislation to create a special chamber and to allow foreign individuals to be of assistance. So that would be a first step, and that would fall ultimately to the legislature to create that. Then the Ministry of Justice would implement it, appointing special judges to be able to hear cases, and then prosecutors and defense counsel to ensure that the cases are scrupulously fair when it comes to the rights of the defendants to due process. So that's an initial first step, is to create the legislative framework that would allow cases to move forward. Then, of course, you have the other transitional justice principles, truth-telling, rehabilitation, etc. Those issues may fall within the purview of different departments. So the Ministry of Health, for example, or of Education, or of the Interior, focusing on truth-telling opportunities to allow for reconciliation at a very local level, so that perpetrators can admit what they did and be reabsorbed into the community, and resolve issues around property, etc. All of this can be done at the local level, but with assistance from different departments within the government.
One of your jobs, as I was reading about you, is to advise the Secretary of State on these kinds of situations. In this case, Anthony Blinken. Probably you go back to the U.S., you brief him. From all of the meetings you've held so far, what do you think about the establishment of this court?
Absolutely. I will be heading back to Washington next week, and I will be briefing senior members of the government, including Secretary of State Blinken, but also individuals who head our Africa Bureau. And I will be conveying everything that I've learned on this trip. I think one set of observations that will be very central is my conversation with civil society, and frankly with the press corps. They had tremendous questions for me about what are the next steps in this transitional justice process, what can be done, where does power lie, how do we get past the impasses, and I will be conveying all of that to the senior leadership back in Washington with my recommendation that, as you said, if something starts to move, that we should be a partner in that effort.
One other recommendation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was reparation for war victims. Are you thinking in that direction also? Is there any way the U.S. can help us? As a matter of fact, 2 days ago, I had 4 Liberian women in my office, some of whom sustained bullet wounds that are still in them. I think they will come around to see you. That's what they told me. Is the U.S. in any way thinking about reparation in the event? Because I heard you talking about 100% support if the idea comes about.
Reparations are an extremely important component of any transitional justice response. We have to focus on the healing of survivors and victims, particularly for the wounds that they may still be carrying, either physical wounds, as you've just described, or at times psychological wounds that can last longer than physical wounds. And so any transitional justice response must include some form of reparation. Now, we know that reparations can be expensive, and there may not be a fund available to pay individual checks for people to try and make them whole. So then we have to think creatively about other ways that the society can be repaired. We can think about communal or collective reparations, symbolic reparations, memorialization, focusing on health and on the rehabilitation of the kinds of wounds that you've described.